She always said she could smell danger long before it entered a room. But glamour has its own scent, and for most of Nancy Slim Keith's life, she followed that perfume straight into the bright, merciless heart of American high society. From Salinas dust to Fifth Avenue hauteur, she traveled through the century like a woman riding a fast horse into a headwind. Windburned, amused, sometimes bruised, and always dressed with clean-line confidence. She collected husbands, cultivated friendships, and held to a personal creed forged by early abandonment. Betrayal is the one sin you don't forgive. She lived by it until one person broke it, a famous and brilliant man she once adored, when he set her secret and shocking life on the page for sport and spectacle. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Slim began far from the manicured terraces of Manhattan. Born Mary Ray Gross on July 15, 1917, in Salinas, California. Her mother soon rechristened her Nancy, a name she wore like a placeholder until she grew the tall, sleek frame that would earn her the nickname Slim. Salinas in the 1920s wasn't picturesque. It was a working town. But Slim's childhood carried the peculiar tension of privilege that didn't protect you from tragedy. When her younger brother was killed in a horrific accident in 1928, the fault line inside the family widened into a canyon. Her father blamed her mother, and in the aftermath, the home became an emotional quarantine ward, with each parent nursing the private bitterness the children were forced to endure. Slim learned early that loyalty was a kind of currency. It was precious, rare, and easily devalued. Her father's departure soon followed, an exit sealed by an extraordinary gesture of parental misreading. He tried to bribe his daughter into joining him, offering her cars, horses, all the trappings of indulgence. But Slim refused. She chose her mother without hesitation, and her father retaliated with total silence. The severing remained permanent, and her father may as well have been dead to her in those years. Years later, she would claim that this early rupture taught her to close doors hard and fast when trust evaporated. Truman Capote would eventually discover just how true that was. School was more a holding pattern than a calling. After some time in a convent where she learned discipline in starched cotton, Slim decided to abandon formal education altogether. At 16, she simply left, climbing behind the wheel of a car and pointing herself toward Death Valley, a landscape that suited her temperament, vast, unforgiving, sunlit to the point of cruelty. It was there, at the Furnace Creek Inn, that she met actor William Powell. He noticed the tall, blonde California girl with the easy stride and soon introduced her to William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies. Within months, she found herself circulating among Hollywood royalty, a teenager in the orbit of names that already filled marquees. Hollywood fell hard for her. Gary Cooper teased her. Cary Grant admired her poise. Clark Gable pursued her with a kind of ardent amusement. Even Ernest Hemingway, whose instinct was to stalk beauty from a distance, warmed to her. Slim had the athleticism of a California outdoorswoman and the verbal snap of someone who refused to be decorative wallpaper. She was not literary, but she was literate in people, their weaknesses, their desires, their private tics. It made her into intoxicating company. By the time she reached her 20s, she was no longer a curiosity, she was a media presence. The magazines fell in line. Harper's Bazaar splashed her across its cover when she was 22, and critics began describing her as the first true California girl. This was not the beach-bleached cliché of later decades, but a prototype. Tall, cool, beautifully scrubbed down to essentials. She understood instinctively that her looks were not an accessory, but an instrument, and she tuned them with the precision of someone who wanted control in a world that pretended to value women only for the show. In 1941, she made her first serious gamble in love and married director Howard Hawks. Hawks had the eye of a cartographer. He could find the map of a story in a single word or gesture, and Slim fascinated him with her movements and speech. She gave him a daughter, Kitty, and in return he delivered her into the highest echelon of Hollywood life. But Hawks was also a philanderer of the old school, completely undeterred by vows or consequences. When the inevitable affairs began, Slim reacted with a clarity that startled her peers. She was not going to be belittled by Hawks or anyone. She packed up her pride and took herself to Havana, ready to rewrite the script. Havana in the 1940s was a place for reinvention, sweaty, dilapidated, yet briefly very glamorous. Hemingway was there, and rumour circulated that Slim and the aging writer crossed the boundary between friendship and lovers. Whether true or invented by gossip, the idea suited her. A woman in flight finding refuge, with a man who towered over the entire culture. In Havana, she was freer, less encumbered by Hawkes's shadow, and into that freedom walked Leland Hayward, the Broadway impresario, whose charm had the polished gleam of a man accustomed to being the most interesting figure in any room. With Hayward, she found not just romance, but real partnership. This was an alliance built on shared social instincts and an appetite for the larger world. They married in 1949. Marriage to Hayward was also a lesson in stamina. He was her great love, but he was also a man for whom attention was lifeblood. Their decade together was marked by betrayals, reconciliations, and glamorous migrations from coast to coast. Slim played the role of the effortlessly stylish wife, but behind the scenes, she navigated the treacherous waters of Hayward's infidelities with a grace that prevented her from ever appearing wounded in public. When the marriage finally collapsed, it was as if the lights dimmed slightly on her world, but she refused to be stranded in the dark. Her next reinvention was more surprising. She married Sir Kenneth Keith, a British aristocrat whose title elevated her to Lady Keith, a transformation that might have felt absurd if it weren't for Slim's uncanny ability to adapt. In England, she played the role fluently, but never fawningly. She kept her American directness, her dry wit and her refusal to be impressed by old money. After the marriage ended in the early 1970s, she kept the Lady Courtesy title like a souvenir. Eventually, she returned to New York, where she settled into a society role that felt more like destiny than habit. By the mid-1950s, Slim had already become a style authority, but her influence extended beyond choosing clothes. Her aesthetic was the opposite of fuss. Where other socialites lacquered their hair into architectural shapes and layered their jewelry until they resembled display cases, Slim preferred sharp trousers, clean jackets, soft loafers and sunlit simplicity. She once described her look as scrubbed clean and polished, which understated the discipline behind it. She wasn't trying to be glamorous, she was refusing to be ornamental. Her approach made her an icon. In 1946, she became the first private citizen to win the Neiman Marcus Fashion Award, a recognition usually reserved for designers, not the women who wore their clothes. Her taste wasn't passive either. It reached into Hollywood's bloodstream. For example, one afternoon during her marriage to Howard Hawks, she came across a photograph of a young model in Harper's Bazaar. The girl had wide eyes, tilted chin, and a smoky intelligence in her gaze. Slim marched the magazine to Hawks and insisted he meet the girl. The model was Betty Joan Perske, soon to become Lauren Bacall. Hawks listened, auditioned her, and cast her in To Have and Have Not. Bacall wore Slim's actual clothes in the film. At least some of Bacall's unforgettable lines, including the famous "You know how to whistle, don't you?" came from Slim's own conversational repertoire. In this way, Slim didn't merely observe Hollywood. She left fingerprints on its myths. It was during her years in New York society that Slim encountered the person who would become both a glittering companion and a catastrophic loss. Truman Capote. She met him through her closest friend, Babe Paley, at a dinner hosted by Diana Vreeland. Truman was small, bright, and possessed of that feline instinct for identifying the most interesting woman in the room. Slim was not immune to charm, and Truman wielded his like a weapon cloaked in silk. She later recalled being enchanted, a word she used sparingly otherwise. Truman collected glamorous, wealthy women the way rare book dealers collect first editions. He called them his swans. Slim quickly became one of his favorites. The relationship worked because each supplied something the other lacked. Slim had social intuition, a map of the elite world etched in her bones. Truman had a verbal flashiness that made her feel newly vivid. She hosted him, traveled with him, gave him the warmth of a confidant without the clutter of neediness. In return, he flattered her wit, her intelligence, her emotional candor. Slim became an early reader of his work, the unfiltered reactions that writers secretly crave. She was the first person to read every draft of In Cold Blood, turning pages while he watched her face for truth. He even relied on her social network to secure contracts, deals, introductions. In those years, they were almost inseparable, moving through Manhattan like a matched set, the dazzling writer and the woman he described with genuine affection as, quote, the very definition of chic. But beneath the laughter and gossip lay the dormant seed of the earlier lesson Slim had learned in childhood. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it cannot be mended. She did not yet know that Capote, in his hunger for literary immortality and social provocation, was preparing to test that principle to its breaking point. By the early 1970s, Slim Keith was still, to outward eyes, an immovable pillar of New York society, lean, bronzed, impeccably tailored, and seasoned enough to know where every body, literal or figurative, was buried. But she was also entering a stage of life in which the margins between friendship, performance, and survival thinned. Capote, the court jester with a novelist's scalpel, had begun drifting into a haze of alcohol, pills, and a corrosive longing to reclaim the literary brilliance he'd tasted within Cold Blood. The Swans, who included Babe Paley, CZ Guest, Lee Radziwill, and Slim, were his lifeline and his raw material. He wanted their stories and their secrets, and he wanted to turn them into art that would stun the world. Slim sensed the danger only dimly at first. She saw the eccentricities, the mood swings, the increasing desperation. But she was loyal, and loyalty sometimes dulls the hearing just long enough for the world to shift beneath your feet. Truman liked to say that he was writing his À la recherche du temps perdu, a grand American novel called Answered Prayers that would peel away the lacquer of privilege and reveal the hearts beating under the diamonds. But what he truly wanted was to shock. He had grown weary of being the darling of the elite, trotted out for dinner parties and charity benefits like a clever performing animal. He wanted to break the spell, to remind people he was dangerous. The Swans had been generous with their confidences. Truman repaid them with a betrayal so public and so flamboyant that it felt almost operatic. In November 1975, Esquire published La Cote Basque 1965, Capote's venomously brilliant slice of answered prayers. The story was set in the kind of restaurant where society matrons sharpened their claws under the tablecloth. Its central gossip monger, Lady Ina Coolberth, was, in everything but name, Slim Keith. Anyone who knew Slim recognized her instantly. The regal posture, the acid humor, the talent for dissecting indiscretions. But Capote didn't stop at caricature. He embedded private scandals, her friends' infidelities, humiliations, whispered confessions, all thinly veiled, just enough to give himself deniability and no one else protection. He even included a scene where Lady Ina recounts an uproarious story about the husband of Cleo Dillon furiously cleaning menstrual blood from his marriage bed after a mistress had visited him while Cleo was away. Cleo and Sidney Dillon were clearly stand-ins for Bill and Babe Paley, Slim's best friends. Slim's world read the piece in a collective shudder. They all knew precisely who was being flayed. For Slim, recognition arrived like a blow. The story wasn't simply unkind, it was a violation of the creed she considered sacred. Truman had taken the trust she offered him, the secrets, the laughter, the private wounds, and fed them into his typewriter for applause. Her reaction was instantaneous and absolute. Just as she had been banished by her father decades earlier, she now banished Truman. She instructed her staff to hang up if he called. She froze him out of parties, dinners, holiday gatherings, the social bloodstream he depended upon. And when friends tried to intercede, she responded with the cool finality of someone who had closed that door forever. She even spoke to lawyers. Capote's pleas, calls, notes, desperate overtures through mutual acquaintances met a war as unyielding as stone. Slim had survived abandonment. She refused to tolerate betrayal. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within days, Truman found himself excommunicated from the golden circle he had both adored and tormented. Babe Paley, mortally wounded by the exposure of her husband's transgressions, ceased all contact. Slim's silence was the loudest of all. A society that had once embraced him now regarded him as radioactive. Capote's decline accelerated. Friends later said that the ostracism hastened his slide into addiction, despair, and the long, slow unraveling that ended with his death in 1984. Slim watched all this from a distance unmoved. Her conviction remained absolute. She had loved him, yes, but Slim Keith loved herself more, and self-respect for her was not negotiable. The years after the Truman-Capote rupture might have undone a woman with fewer reinventions behind her. But Slim was built of sterner materials. She had weathered broken marriages, shifting social climates, and the constant scrutiny of a world that devoured its own darlings. Instead of retreating, she slid comfortably into the role of grande dame. New York society in the late 20th century was losing some of its old theatricality. The Park Avenue salons and cigarette-hazed supper clubs were giving way to a more corporate, less eccentric elite. But Slim still inhabited the old world, and people recognized her as a link to a vanished glamour. Her style, always effortless, now took on the authority of a signature. Younger women watched her for cues. The way she paired a masculine jacket with the softest silk blouse. The way she kept her hair clean, unadorned, unconcerned, with the towering coiffures of the 1960s and 70s. The way she refused excess as if it were a vulgarity. She wasn't minimalist, she was exact. And in a culture increasingly smitten with spectacle, Slim Keith's restraint looked almost radical. This aesthetic authority wasn't merely symbolic. She continued to appear in best-dressed lists and fashion retrospectives, her image becoming shorthand for the understated American elegance that designers wished they could bottle. But even icons suffer the decay of the mortal coil. Slim had smoked for most of her life, and smoked with the abandon of a generation that viewed cigarettes not as a health hazard, but as punctuation, an exclamation point of sophistication. The habit caught up with her in the late 1980s. Yet she remained, almost to the end, characteristically private about her failing health. There was no melodrama, no pleading for sympathy. She received friends when she wished to see them and refused when she didn't. If her world was shrinking, she did not allow anyone to see her diminished. In 1990, Slim published her memoir called Slim: Memories of a Rich and Imperfect Life. The title captured her with almost eerie precision. The book was not a confessional. She had no interest in self-flagellation. Instead, it was a selective unveiling, a mosaic of observations, anecdotes, and judiciously chosen revelations. She described her childhood trauma, her marriages, her friendships, her disdain for pretension. She wrote of Capote too, but with a distance that suggested the wound, though historic, had never fully healed. Readers sensed a woman determined to write her own ending, to claim authorship over a life that many had tried to narrate for her. But the memoir was also a coda. On April 16, 1990, Slim Keith died of lung cancer at 72. Her departure was neither sudden nor prolonged, simply final. The society pages mourned her in elegant tones, noting the passing of a woman who had seemed, for decades, to embody a certain disappearing American ideal of worldly glamour and incisive wit. Her friends described her as fierce, loyal, uncompromising. Her critics, those who felt the sting of her sharp humor, called her formidable. Slim might have smirked at the euphemisms. She had lived too vividly to be embalmed in polite adjectives. In the years that followed, Slim Keith's reputation acquired a curious afterglow. She became a character in other people's stories. Biographies on Truman, novels about the Swans, retrospectives on mid-century style, and the major TV shows of recent years. The collective memory holds on to a visual, a tall, sun-touched woman in tailored trousers, a face open but inscrutable, her clothes conveying a kind of elegant refusal to play anyone's puppet. In the end, Slim Keith's life reads like a novel, written in clean, decisive sentences. A girl from Salinas, who became a woman of Manhattan, a hawk-eyed observer of human folly, a muse to Hollywood, and finally a symbol of the intelligence that hides behind elegance. Her story remains not just a tale of high society, but a reminder that some women move through the world not by chasing spotlight, but by mastering the art of being unforgettable. Alright, I hope you found this one enjoyable. Let me know which others among Capote's swans you'd be interested in hearing about. Quite a fascinating bunch. I've been Chester, thanks for tuning in, I'll see you next time.